Alarm! Alarm!
I know, it's a bit of a meme that I would rant about this whenever it's brought up on stream, but I think it's time to seriously talk about the biggest issue facing eveonline right now: projection. In my almost 20 years of playing with no breaks, I have led some of the biggest fleets for one of the biggest alliances in the game, but in recent years, I also really fell in love with solo and small game PvP. As part of the CSM, I have warned CZP, now Fenris, of the long-term impact in detail, which I'll also include in this video. So let me be clear, this is not a rant. This is just me trying to lay out my argument in a more complete way, which can be a little bit hard to do live on stream, simply because it's super complicated. And I always get stuck explaining details, but at the same time, I never really get to explain the full thing 100%. But it's an important topic. Some argue maybe the most important topic in EVE today. So I'm trying this approach. So let me begin by explaining what power projection actually is, just so we're on the same page and we avoid some confusion here. Because most people will think of ansiblexes right away, but they ignore the other forms of projections. So let's start by talking about the oldest and simplest form of projection, to also set the standard for all the other forms of projection that are to follow, and to explain to you guys what I think are the 5 core factors. Starting at the top, as you can see here, this is a radar chart, which I think is probably the best form to visualize the actual power of any form of projection. So at the top, you see reach, which basically means distance and time. Now, time would be a reasonable amount of time, which obviously would be different depending on what you do. Like a 200-man fleet trying to get to a very important timer might think it's reasonable to travel for an hour, while 5 guys roaming to just have a good fight. Yeah, no, these guys are probably not super happy about traveling for an hour. So it'll always be kind of subjective. That also counts for all the other ones generally, right? So keep that in mind. But I'm trying my best to keep it kind of scientific here, all right? So the next one up would be power. Very simply, what can you move with it? In this case, gauge travel, you can move everything you want, right? You can move Super Titans, everything through gates. Yeah, you can't get them into high sec, but no form of projection can move Super Titans into high sec, right? So then the next one would be safety. Well, I think in this case, safety, well, are you losing ships every time you use them? And the answer is yes. I think as far as safety goes, gates are probably the most unsafe way, simply because it's very predictable for hostiles. And they can use the same form of projection, so they can catch up with you, they can keep you there, and so on, right? So safety, very low when it comes to gate travel. Then ease. Ease is another factor where, in this case, you don't need to prepare anything. It's not very hard to do. In this case, you just, hit destination and you start traveling. Easy peasy, right? And then there's reliability, which basically is the question, is it always available? Or are you gambling a little bit on having it available? Or are there any other factors? But in this case, the gates are always there. You know they'll always be there. You don't have to worry about it. So they're very, very reliable. And you can also see what I call the footprint. That's basically the surface area of the graph, just to have a number to compare, right? Then, next up we have wormholes. In the case of wormholes, I think reach, yes, technically you can get anywhere, but realistically, you're always going to be a couple jumps out at least. But it is fairly far, right? So I went with 80% here. Then power, obviously there's a huge limitation on mass, and you can't move any supers and titans. You can move some caps, but only a few, and only if you have the right wormhole. But at the same time, a 250-man subcap fleet, you can fairly reliably get it from A to B if you're prepared, right? So that's still pretty powerful. Then we have safety. I think once you've got a route and you move through it fairly quick, like it's very, very, very safe. It's very unpredictable for hostiles, and you almost never see people like lose fleets or whatever in wormholes moving through, right? We're not talking about wormhole fights in general or like living in wormhole space. This is just the projection aspect, right? Moving from A to B. Then the next one up would be ease. I think in this case, that's where wormholes struggle a bit. You have to prepare, right? So on a moment's notice, it's very hard to have the right wormhole. But if someone says, hey, in 2 hours, we need to be in who knows where, there's a fair chance you can do it, but it is a lot of preparation. And then there's no guarantee either, which leads me to the next point, which is reliability, right? You can't really guarantee it. It can be rolled and so on. It is not zero with a lot of work. You can still pretty reliably get connections, but yeah. So that's wormholes. So then we come to filaments, which if you look at this graph, you can already make out a pattern, I think, which is healthy forms of projection always have like 1 or 2 advantages, but they lack in others, right? So in the case of filaments, obviously your reach is incredible, but the power is very, very limited. While the safety is, I mean, kind of in the middle. It was hard for me to guess where to put the safety here. I put it kind of in the middle because, yeah, you can get caught and you don't know where you land, so you might, die in destination or whatever. But then it is very easy. You just click the button and power, you're there. But reliability, very, very low. You could argue you could put it to 0, but I think you can kind of predict still where you would end up in certain time zones. So it's not completely 0. And then here we come to our first outlier, really, which is jump clones, which you could even argue, is it a form of projection? Because you're not actually moving ships, right? So it's a bit of a tricky situation. And technically the reach, you could say, is maximum. You could get anywhere, but you can only get to the places that you already have prepared, right? Where you have a jump clone, a citadel, a station, whatever. And then power, well, would we put the power on maximum because you could just jump clone and have anything there? Or should we put the power on 0 because you're not actually moving a ship across the map, right? So I went with the middle ground here. It's a bit of a weird one, like I said, right? And safety, obviously, it's very, very safe to do. Like you cannot be stopped, basically, right? And then ease, yeah, you just jump clone, right? But it does take preparation, right? Keep that into account. You have to move your clone beforehand. You have to have a citadel or a station there. So it's not maximum ease, right? And then there's reliability, which, yes, it's very reliable because you can always count on your jump clones, really. But there is a timer there, right? The 20-hour timer and the cooldown. So I didn't want to put it too high either. Right, so it's somewhere in the middle. You can't do this endlessly. And then we come to the first big topic here, which is sinos and jump drives. And you can already see it's a bit of a bigger graph, and it has a much bigger footprint. So reach is now limited with fatigue, but power is to the absolute max, and it's very safe to do. It's generally pretty easy, but you do need preparation in terms of sinos and in terms of having citadels and stations there, right? You wouldn't really project super far and doing a lot of jumps like somewhere in the open with your pants off, right? That's just not what people would like to do. Then reliability, it's very reliable, but yeah, once you have your stuff in place, right? So in this case, it was a bit tricky because reliability, ease, reach, they're kind of interchangeable in some ways, but I think this is kind of the middle ground where I feel like it kind of represents it pretty well. And then we come to the big one, kind of literally. Antiplexes have an insane amount of reach. You can get very, very far, very, very quickly. The power is kind of incredible. Besides Supers and Titans, you can move anything with it. Then the safety, I believe, is pretty high. Yes, some people die on antiplexes, but in general, if you know what you're doing, it's very, very safe to do. Then ease is pretty high, I didn't max it out. Yes, you can just set destination and travel, but someone has to put them up. Someone has to manage them, fuel them. And then reliability. I think reliability is very, very high. They often never get revved. And if they get revved, well, there's usually redundancy, especially when it comes to important connections. Then you'll have usually a second, maybe even a third one lined up. You can already see by the footprint, which is 159, it's like way higher than any of these other forms of projection. And this is also where I kind of want to give you guys a little bit of an insight in history, because it's not the first time we had something with this much projection in the game. So this is the graph of sinos and jump drives from 2014. For those who don't know, back in 2014, you had no fatigue, and the only limiting factors that kept you from jumping was the session timer, which is 15 seconds, and having cap. The cap issue wasn't really that hard to get around. You either have an injector fit or you have a flux coil fit. Either way, you can be jump ready again within 15 seconds and you never break your session timer. So in theory, if you jump into low seg where there's no bubbles, someone would want to land on you and tackle you with a hick. They would have to lock you first, but you have your invuln timer still going. So you land on grid and you jump out before he ever gets the chance to even lock you. And this is not an over-exaggeration. That's literally what we did back then. So in this case, obviously, reach. You can get anywhere very quickly. Like, I was tempted to put the reach even out of the graph, honestly. Power, anything you can move, right? Then the safety, very, very hard to stop. Super safe to do. And ease, well, you could debate the ease point here because having a vast sino network isn't that easy. But I also think once it's set up and you have enough people doing this, it's not that hard either. Okay? It's very, very, very easy, to be honest. And then reliability, well, you still needed a sino in the right place at the right time and so on, right? So reliability, I wouldn't want to go to the max. So this is the only form of projection that has ever been stronger than Ansiblexes are right now. But let me show you what that actually looked like. In the background, you can see the Eve map, and you can follow along the PL cap fleet in real time. So at the time, there were basically just two groups. I mean, almost like today, right? It was CFC, aka Goons and Friends, and then there was N3, aka NCPL and Friends. And especially NCPL were constantly looking for content for their cap pilots and so on. So over time, they built a vast network for sino chains. And everyone knew and understood this, right? So medium alliances like Init at the time would always be on a timer. So whenever we would field a bunch of caps, let's say we want to one-shot a pause, which that's around 50 dreads, you would field 50 dreads and you would only do one cycle. You would never do a second siege cycle because 5 minutes, if they're prepared and ready to go, they could reach you. So every medium alliance was always on a timer. And oftentimes, even if you followed those rules and you were super careful, you wouldn't have a chance. So when whoever we were fighting at the time didn't feel like they had the numbers on us or whatever, they could always reach out because they knew too. There's NCPL just looking to blob for them, right? So obviously they used that, right? And obviously NCPL wouldn't complain. I mean, that's free content right there. You can't blame them, really, right? PL was staged in LXQ, and we were staged in Quirius, and there was a fight in Delph in 319 that I remember. So just in the time I was talking about this, right now, they're almost in jump range. As you can see, the red timer at the bottom, that's our siege cycle. So we are still in siege, and they're well in range in a sec. So yeah, what would that look like if a capital fleet can be anywhere at any given time? And I think it's just logical to say, well, that means the biggest, strongest capital fleet will dominate the entire map. In this case, we almost got lucky, or maybe it's a natural kind of thing in EVE, that there's still at least 2 groups, right? So at least we had CFC and N3, and not just one, because, that would be the blue donut, obviously. And so this is what the result looked like on the map. As you can see, the entire map is basically split in 2. Almost uncanny how close that looks to today's map. But I think this is the result of the ability to control vast areas of space. People will control vast areas of space. Once they do control them, there's not really that much of a need to fight. Like, why would they need more space, right? Which then would lead to kind of stagnation. So these 2 groups would never really fight each other fully, which, yes, there was the Battle of BTEC-R, but it's not like one of these groups was, fought to extinction or anything. So with the stagnation, then comes less meaningful fights. Meaning, if you don't need any space, all the fights that ever happen are kind of for content, right? And it might sound fun, for content, but if you take the meaning out of it, in my opinion, that's less fun, really. And if you have less fun in the game, well, guess what? There's going to be less players. And less players will obviously result in less fights, which is less fun, and so on, right? So there's this like cycle going on right there. And the end result is the game will be declining as a result of this. Just to compare this to today's map, here is today's map. It looks very, very similar, right? Almost uncanny, like I said. Today's map also had the issue for the longest time of centralization, which means groups are not only bigger, but they're also more centralized in one spot, in one staging system. Not only is it alliances are all in one system nowadays, that wasn't always the case, by the way, but now even coalitions, several alliances share staging more commonly. And the problem with that is you will have less but bigger alliances, and then less responsibility and meaning for these alliances. So basically, these alliances, they don't have to really do their own thing. They're just doing coalition business. So them being able to be self-sufficient and the ability to stand on their own 2 feet is very diminished. And which then, over time, the longer this isn't changed, will lead to more centralization, which again is one of those cycles, and it's coming back and it's getting worse over time. So what did they do in 2014 is they introduced jump fatigue. So let me show you the 2014 map again. Here we go. And then the next map is 6 months after. And you can already see a huge difference. Just 6 months after, you already see the map splitting up. And that's just by jump fatigue changing. Now, not every change on the map is due to that, but I think it's very, very obvious that this is the major factor here, right? If you compare the 2 maps, huge difference. And then only a year after, you already see more segregation, but also the forming of new coalitions. So suddenly we have like 5, 6 coalitions on the map. So I think history has actually shown us what too much projection looks like on the map. Now let's talk about what needs to be fixed exactly. Problem number 1, reach. Simply as I explained it before, it's how far you can project in a reasonable amount of time. And at the moment, there is no limit as to how far you can go with ansiplexes. Granted, as long as you hold the space. But ansiplexes also make it much, much easier to expand. So over time, that will be further and further. Then problem number 2 is not really talked about at all, which is deterrence. Meaning, no group really wants to live anywhere close to big block antiplex networks. It's almost like you would want big blocks to hold a gun to your head while you live there. But it's not the only problem with it, I think, because it would also slow down any effect of a good change, like in 2014. we had a bunch of different groups ready to go and take some space and attack maybe bigger groups and take something from them. In 2026, we don't have this. So there might be a group here and there, but in general, it's just too little. And they would just make themselves an easy target for free content. And then there is another problem, which is more on the developer side of things, which is the implementation of changes. All nullsec groups have adjusted for this level of projection that we have right now for the better part of a decade. So flipping this around from one day to the other would hurt almost all of nullsec and probably drop activity to an all-time low. But too soft of a change won't have the impact that we need either. So it's not easy to find the right balance. Actually, I would argue in one change, it probably is impossible. So the ability and willingness to iterate is super important, I think. And honestly, I would say best would be to have a roadmap laid out from the start, where you have a clear path that's communicated so big groups can actually plan ahead and not be caught off guard and make it easy for their members to adjust. So here are some of the suggestions you will see on how to fix these things. Number one, I think we've all heard it before, is fatigue. Now there's different versions of fatigue and some of them are better than others. But in this case, I'm just going to explain the most basic version, which I also call lazy fatigue, because it's simply lazy, honestly. Basically, you take an antiplex and you get fatigue, just like capitals. I think depending on the numbers, of course, details are always important, but depending on the numbers, it would have a huge impact on large-scale power projection, which is the main issue, really. But negatives, I believe, will still outweigh the positives, and there is much better solutions out there. And the most negative aspect of lazy fatigue really is the casual and daily use, which basically forces people to calculate if they want to do this right now or if it's going to have a negative effect on potential activities later, like fleets. So basically someone doing PI or doing some sites or whatever, they would have to think about taking an antiplex, or if they're gonna be able to get back and join that fleet. That maybe takes place later. I do think it would have a positive impact on the centralization issue too, where alliances would adjust to it and they would put corps in charge of different areas for like standing fleets and such. But I think, again, generally, there's just better solutions out there. And then also another issue that I talked about earlier is antiplexes would still be there and be a deterrent. Like, yes, technically you have the fatigue and technically people know, but that deterrent, it might not completely stop people from doing it and taking space near them and maybe killing the antiplexes at some point and stuff, but I think it would slow things down significantly. So next up would be polarization, which is a very similar concept to fatigue, but they're basically simple timers. So there's no space math required. You know that if you jump this antiplex, you cannot take another one for like 5 minutes or whatever the number would be. It avoids confusion and it is scalable, which is, I think, a huge advantage. It's much easier to scale this in terms of maximum projection. So you know exactly how long it takes for someone to travel from A to B using antiplexes. It does still feel punishing, not as much as fatigue, but a little bit. And I do think polarization alone won't change a whole lot. And also the deterrent is still there. Antiplexes would still be super far out. And if people want to live near them, even if they know there's less of a deterrent than fatigue, but it's still similar. But I think polarization is probably the better version of a timer-based solution. Then we come to limitations. So what that means is any kind of limit on how many and where you can anchor your antiplexes. So you simply can't anchor them everywhere. It can be based on jumps or light years from a capital system. those are the most common ones, I think. An example would be alliances can only anchor antiplexes within 20 light years or 20 jumps of a capital system, just to give you a number, right? I think it does remove the deterrent, which is an important factor, I think. You would see an immediate effect because some antiplexes are just gone. And another thing is it's very scalable. It's very easy to adjust, right? We don't have to start at, you can only do 5 jumps. You could start at the point where we are right now and then scale it back slowly. It would create an incentive to create alt alliances though. If you do only this, if you only limit them, then that would create an incentive. So it's very important that if you were to do the limitation approach, you would also have to remove them from ACLs, for example, which currently allows owners to grant characters and entire groups access to the entire network. And then there's another very popular approach, which is just disruption mechanics. Disabling them, reinforcing is one of them, increased risk, and so on, right? So, for example, it would be like introducing the ability to follow through. That's a popular one, I think. And I think it's all fun to think about, but overall, it doesn't really approach the core issues, right? Yes, opportunities for fights would increase, and it feels very sandboxy, which I think is always a plus, but, I would prefer more gameplay oriented approaches than what it looks like from the outside, but whatever. But like I said, I don't think it changes anything about the core issue, and therefore I think any kind of disruption mechanics, sure, it's a cool gimmick, but really cannot be I can't take it seriously, honestly. And then I think there's another one which I call cost at maintenance nerfs. That's basically just increasing the liquid ozone or cost per jump. Yes, technically, the more you use it, the more it will cost, and the bigger the group, the more they will use it, and so on. So it would hit the bigger groups more. But I tell you what, the bigger groups have deeper pockets, so they will just be fine, okay? I think it would feel very punishing for few core members of each group. And guess what? Bigger groups have more people. I think overall it would hit smaller groups more than big groups. And again, I don't think it changes a thing in terms of maximum projection. So that's a big no-no for me. That'd be very disappointing to see. And to finish it off, I think this is a fun one, which is passwords. I think passwords, you could almost put them in the same category as disruption mechanics, to be fair. It really doesn't change anything about a maximum force projection. But I mean, technically, the bigger the group, the more likely the password is known generally. So it would actually hit big groups more than small groups. And honestly, like I said, it's just a fun one, I think. I also think big groups would probably adjust more than people like to see, and they would just change their passwords constantly, and even before ops and stuff like this. So I don't know about the effect overall, but it's just a fun one that I kind of wanted to mention here. So the question now is, what exactly are Fenris about to do? And this is what they announced yesterday. Antiplexes will get a capacitor of some sort, and there will be different zones with different cap usages depending on the distance to the capital of the owning alliance. And the result of that will be they will kind of act similar to wormholes, but they will recharge. But one key thing they also said is, which I mentioned earlier, which I think is very important, is that they take it off ACLs. Now, I also talked about the ACL part in terms of problems, which is it creates an incentive to fold alliances into one. But there is a sort of limitation here. It's not a hard limitation in terms of ability to anchor antiplexes, but it is a limitation in terms of how far you can get with them with the big fleets. Now, we don't know the exact numbers and details, but FC Okami talked about what the intention of those changes is. And therefore, you know, I have to make some assumptions here. And I think the result overall is pretty good, since it has a huge potential on impact on reach, which obviously is the number one problem here. Iteration shouldn't be all too hard to do with this kind of concept. The deterrence is a bit of a problem still. Antiplexes will still be in place, most likely. I don't know, maybe the furthest zone will have a no anchor kind of thing to it. Who knows? But then, yeah, hopefully you don't need to do space math or any of that sort in order to see if you can actually take an Antiplex with a fleet or, you know, solo or whatever. So overall, I actually kind of like this concept. But personally, I would have wished for a little bit more of a limitation in terms of anchoring to remove the deterrence. But I have to say, I do not expect the whole doom and gloom situation that some people are putting out there on Reddit, where alliances that have a decent amount of identity, for example, be it Brave, or be it Sigma, or be it PL, to fold into their bigger partner alliances. Certainly there will be some, but those alliances most likely are already like one big alliance anyway, and I don't think that will be too much of a change in general. And before I end this video, I also want to mention what if antiplexes were fixed. Because I think the next big issue then would be wormholes, meaning big groups, they have a lot of manpower. Getting a specific connection, even on a fairly short notice, is not that hard for them. And even if there was a fleet showing up only for big timers, for example, it would have a massive impact on any conflict. I'm not super sure how to fix this issue, so I won't talk about that part today, but I really wanted to mention this. Alright, so I think I covered at least 95% of what I consider a very complex topic, and I hope I got my points across. If you got any good arguments for or against what I said, feel free to comment. I'm generally not scared to change my mind. If you would like me to keep going in this direction in terms of content, leave a like and suggest the next topic perhaps. For those who would like to discuss things live, feel free to jump in my stream or the Discord. I'll link it below. And other than that, this is it from me. Have a good one and see you around. And don't forget to use the code zehPando.